The temperature outside had been dropping for 3 days straight before Daniel Reeves finally understood that he was truly on his own. Not metaphorically on his own the way people say it, when they mean things are difficult and inconvenient. Truly on his own. As in, no heat, no backup plan, no family member with a spare room, no friend with a couch that hadn't already been silently withdrawn. He was standing in the gravel lot outside a house he had lived in for 4 years, with everything he owned in the bed of a rusted pickup truck, and a sky the color of old pewter pressing down from every direction. The forecast that morning had said the temperature would reach somewhere around 8 degrees below zero by nightfall. The kind of cold that turns your breath into fog before it leaves your mouth, that makes your hands stop working right within 60 seconds of bare exposure, that kills car engines and water pipes and people who underestimate it. He was 31 years old, out of options he could see clearly, and somewhere in the next few hours, he was going to have to figure out where he was sleeping that night. What happened in the weeks before that moment is a story that a lot of people would recognize, even if the exact details were different. A relationship that had been unraveling for longer than either person had been willing to admit had finally come apart completely. And it had come apart in the worst possible season, in the worst possible way. There had been no dramatic argument, no single moment of rupture. Just a slow accumulation of silence and distance, until one morning, there was nothing left to hold the thing together, and the person who owned the house made it clear that the arrangement was finished. He had 3 days to get his things out. He got them out in 2, because pride works that way when everything else is gone. He loaded the truck with tools and clothes and the few pieces of furniture he could fit, and he drove away without looking back at the house, not because he was being stoic, but because there was something in his chest that would have broken open if he had. The problem he was facing was not just the cold, though the cold was going to become the most immediate problem within hours. The problem was money, or the specific kind of shortage that doesn't leave you with obvious choices. He had enough in his checking account to cover a motel for maybe 5 or 6 nights. After that, he would be making the kind of decisions that start with cutting back on food and end in places he didn't want to think about yet. He had a job, a decent one, working construction and framing for a small company that did residential work, but the pay cycle meant he wouldn't see another check for almost 2 weeks. The timing was the kind of thing that makes a person believe the universe has a sense of humor, dark and specific, and aimed directly at you. He sat in the parking lot of a gas station on the edge of town, with the truck running for heat, and he went through his options the way you go through options when they are genuinely limited, one slowly and with a kind of mechanical honesty that only comes when you stop pretending. He could spend the money on the motel and figure out the rest later. He could call his brother in another state, who had his own problems and his own family squeezed into a house that was already too small. He could ask his boss, a man named Glenn Harwick, who ran the construction crew, with the no-nonsense fairness of someone who had built things with his hands his whole life, whether there was any cash advance possible. Or he could think about the one piece of property that sat between himself and genuine homelessness, the old Kessler barn on the edge of the rural county road that he had been using as a storage site for tools and materials for the past 2 years. The barn belonged to a retired farmer named Roy Kessler, who had let Daniel use it in exchange for keeping the property maintained, a handshake arrangement that had worked well for both of them. It wasn't a home. It had no insulation to speak of, no running water, no plumbing. The gaps between the boards let the wind come through with only slightly less force than outside. But it had walls and a roof that didn't leak, and it had Daniel's tools inside it. And right then, that was more than most people who found themselves where he was standing could say. He drove out to the barn before he made any other decision. He sat in the truck with the engine running, and he looked at the structure for a long time. It was a classic gambrel-roofed barn, the kind you see in the middle of rural America in 100,000 fields. Weathered gray boards, a pair of large doors on the south side, 2 side windows with no glass left in them, a concrete floor that had been poured in segments sometime in the middle of the last century. Inside there were his tools, his air compressor, his framing nailer, his collection of hand tools organized in a chest he had built himself, 2 rolls of house wrap he hadn't used on the last job, a folding table, a cot he had left there months ago after a late working session, and perhaps most importantly, a modest supply of dimensional lumber he had set aside from project overages. He had salvaged a small cast-iron wood stove from a demolition job the previous spring, planning to put it in a workshop someday, and it was sitting in the corner of the barn on a pallet, still uninstalled, still waiting for the right project. He sat in that truck for almost 40 minutes. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the barn doors in a way that made the building seem less like shelter than it had 5 minutes ago. And then something shifted in how he was looking at the problem. He was a framing carpenter. He spent his professional life building the structural bones of other people's homes by calculating spans and loads, understanding how materials behaved under stress, knowing instinctively how to create an enclosed, protected space from raw materials. He was sitting in front of a structure with a roof and walls and a floor, and he had tools and lumber and time. The question wasn't whether he could build something that would get him through the winter. The question was what specifically he should build and how fast he could build it, and whether the solution he was imagining was actually going to work the way he thought it would. What he was imagining was a Quonset shape, not a full-sized metal Quonset hut of the kind that became famous during World War II, those corrugated steel half-cylinders that the military scattered across the Pacific Theater for temporary shelter and storage. What he was thinking about was a small version of that same principle, a curved ribbed structure that derived its strength from its shape, rather than from the thickness of its materials, built inside the existing barn as a shelter within a shelter. The concept was elegant in the way that solutions to real problems often are when you understand the underlying engineering. The barn would act as a windbreak and a secondary layer of protection. The inner structure, insulated and sealed, would hold heat efficiently because of its curved geometry. A curved surface has less wall area relative to enclosed volume than a box does, which means less surface through which heat can escape for the same amount of interior space. He had learned this not from a textbook, but from years of watching what held up and what didn't, from observing how shapes performed under load and stress and weather. The cold was coming regardless. The question was whether he could build fast enough to be inside something warm before it arrived in its full force. And he called Glenn Harwick that evening, not to ask for money, though that conversation was also coming. He called because Glenn had a property about 2 miles from the Kessler barn, and he thought there might be scraps from a recent job that Daniel could use. Glenn answered on the second ring, listened without interrupting, while Daniel explained the situation in the flat, practical terms of a man who had decided to solve the problem rather than perform his feelings about it, and then was quiet for a moment. He told Daniel to come by the yard first thing in the morning, that there was a full sheet of 1/2-inch plywood left over from the Hendersons' job, plus some rigid foam insulation board that had been cut and wasn't going back to the supplier. He said he wasn't in the business of watching a good framer freeze to death. He didn't make it sentimental. He just told Daniel what was available and said goodnight. That was the kind of man Glenn Harwick was. Daniel spent that first night in the truck, parked inside the barn with the engine running in intervals, waking every hour and a half to run it for warmth before letting it idle down again. The temperature inside the barn by midnight was somewhere around 15 degrees, which was warmer than outside, but not by an amount that felt meaningful when you were trying to sleep. He lay in the cab under a sleeping bag and a canvas drop cloth, and he thought about the structure he was going to build. He had a rough plan forming in his head, a frame built from 2x4s bent into arches at specific intervals, connected by horizontal purlins, skinned with plywood and house wrap on the outside and insulated within. Small enough to heat with the wood stove, large enough to stand up in and move around comfortably. Something he could build alone in a day and a half if he pushed hard and the materials cooperated. He sketched the dimensions on the back of a gas receipt with a carpenter's pencil by the light of his phone. 12 feet long, 8 feet wide at the base, standing roughly 6.5 feet at the peak of the arch. He calculated the arch radius, the spacing of the ribs, the load the bent lumber would need to carry. 2x4s bent over a jig would give him the curve he needed if he pre-soaked them slightly and worked fast. He had done bent framing before on decorative work, on barrel ceilings for a custom home in the county, and he understood how wood responded to moisture and stress and how to get it to hold a curve without splitting. He knew the failure points. He knew what to watch for. By the time he fell into the kind of exhausted sleep you get when the cold has been working on you for hours, he had the structure clear enough in his mind that he could see the individual steps in sequence, or the way experienced builders carry a project in their heads before the first board is cut. Glenn's yard the next morning had more than promised. There were 3 full sheets of 1/2-inch plywood, a roll of 6mm poly sheeting, 2 bundles of pink fiberglass batt insulation that had been left from an insulation job, and a partial roll of house wrap. Glenn himself was there when Daniel arrived, and without making a production of it, he handed over a box of framing screws, onto a tube of construction adhesive and a bag of mixed fasteners. He told Daniel the materials were a loan against future labor, which both of them understood to mean something different than the technical definition of a loan. He also mentioned that his neighbor had a cord of split hardwood that he would sell at a fair price to someone who needed it. Daniel bought half a cord on the spot, with money that was supposed to last the week, because he had already run the numbers in his head and understood that dry firewood was not a luxury item in this particular situation. It was the whole equation. The work started that morning, and it was the kind of work that Daniel was genuinely good at, the kind that required both physical strength and an understanding of how materials wanted to behave and how to work with that rather than against it. He set up a bending jig on the barn floor first, so in a simple form made from short pieces of scrap, 2x4 screwed to a sheet of plywood at the precise radius he had calculated the night before. He cut his arch ribs from 16-foot 2x4s, soaked the middle sections with water from the jugs he had in the truck, and bent them over the jig slowly and deliberately, letting the wood take the curve instead of forcing it. The first 3 arches went perfectly. The 4th split along a grain line he hadn't seen coming, and he had to start over, which cost him almost 40 minutes and put a cold edge of frustration into the afternoon. He worked through it without stopping. When you are building something that your survival depends on, even partially, even in the way that this situation only partially depended on this structure, the frustration is different than it is on a normal job. It is quieter and more focused. It doesn't spiral. It just becomes another problem to solve. Think about what it would feel like to be in that barn on that afternoon. The temperature outside is dropping steadily, and the wind is beginning to pick up for real, finding every gap in the old boards and sending thin, cold fingers across the concrete floor. Your hands are working, but they are stiff, and you have to stop every 30 minutes to warm them against your chest or against the small propane torch you are using to keep the work site at a temperature where your fingers can still feel what they are doing. You are building something that does not yet exist, from a design that exists only in your head, with materials that are almost, but not quite sufficient for what you need them to do. And there is no one watching. No one to tell you whether the plan is going to work. No foreman, no building inspector, no partner standing nearby with a second opinion. Just you and the wood and the cold and the hours going by. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have kept building, trusting the plan you had drawn on a gas receipt at midnight? Or would you have made a different choice, cut your losses, found a different way? I think about that question every time I hear a story like this one, because the answer says something real about a person that normal life rarely reveals. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know how you would have approached that moment. By late afternoon of the first day, Daniel had 8 arches standing, bolted to a base plate he had screwed into the concrete using masonry anchors, connected at the peak by a ridge purlin and at 2 intermediate heights by lateral purlins that tied the structure together and gave it the rigidity that a curved frame needs to resist lateral movement. The shape was unmistakably Quonset, a smooth half-cylinder rising from the barn floor, and even in its incomplete state, it had a solidity to it that he could feel when he put his hand on the frame. The ribs had taken the curve cleanly and held it without wanting to spring back, which told him the soaking and the jig work had been right. He covered the frame that first evening with the poly sheeting just to get it out of the wind, tacked it in place temporarily, and then he spent the second night in the cab of the truck again, slightly warmer than the first because the truck was now parked directly alongside the partially completed structure, and the barn interior had retained some of the warmth generated by his moving body during the workday. The second day was when the real cold arrived. He woke at 5 in the morning, and the temperature inside the barn was 9 degrees. The air felt like something solid, like a substance, rather than just the absence of warmth. He ran the truck engine for 20 minutes before he could feel his feet properly. Then he made the decision that people who have never been in a situation like this sometimes find hard to understand from the outside. So he decided to install the wood stove before the shell was complete, not because it was the most efficient sequence from a construction standpoint, but because his body needed heat to keep working, and the stove needed a functioning chimney pipe before anything else got built around it, and he wasn't going to wait another full day for warmth on the other side of 11 degrees. He installed the stove in the southeast corner of the frame. When setting it on a pad of fire brick he assembled from loose bricks he found stacked along the barn wall, the kind of brick that had been sitting there long enough that the previous owner had probably forgotten they existed. He cut the chimney pipe through the roof of the Quonset frame using a hole saw, fitted it with a thimble collar to keep the sheet material from making contact with the hot pipe, and ran the pipe straight up and through the barn roof above, using the existing gap around a rusted ventilation cap that had been there for decades. He had done this kind of installation before on renovation jobs, and he did it carefully and correctly, checking clearances twice before he was satisfied. Then he built a small fire from scrap lumber, nothing fancy, just enough to verify that the draw was working and the smoke was going where it was supposed to go. When the first real heat came off that stove and spread into the space around it, it was not dramatic. It was not the kind of movie moment where a person breaks down with relief or raises their arms in triumph. It was quieter than that, a slow spreading warmth that moved from the stove outward, that began to push back the 9-degree air inch by inch. As that made his hands work better, and his thinking get clearer, and his body start to relax from the constant low-level tension that cold imposes on every muscle. He sat next to the stove for 15 minutes, with his hands around a cup of coffee from his thermos, and he let himself feel it. Just the heat. Just the fact that he had made fire happen in a space he was building with his own hands, and the worst of the night was already a few degrees more survivable than it had been an hour ago. The outer shell went on the second day in stages. He fixed the plywood panels to the ribs using the framing screws Glenn had given him, cutting each panel with a circular saw to fit the curve, scribing the edges carefully so they seated cleanly against the purlin. The house wrap went over the plywood in horizontal overlaps, taped at the seams with the construction tape he had found in his tool chest, creating a layer that would stop air infiltration even where the plywood had minor gaps. The insulation went inside, bat fiberglass tucked between the ribs and held in place with strips of lath he ripped from a spare piece of 1x6. The interior skin was the last layer, thin plywood paneling screwed directly to the ribs over the insulation, trapping the fiberglass in place and giving the interior a clean surface that reflected the light from his work lamp and made the space feel more finished than its materials had any right to suggest. The door was a piece of work that Daniel was later privately proud of. He had no door hardware and no manufactured door unit, and no way to get either one without spending money he didn't have and driving time he couldn't afford. What he had was a half sheet of 3/4-inch plywood, a pair of exterior door hinges from his hardware collection, a length of foam weather stripping, a hook and eye latch, and the problem-solving instinct that comes from years of making things work with what is actually present rather than what would be ideal. He built the door frame from doubled 2x4s, carefully squared and braced, set into the end of the Quonset curve at a point where the height was just over 6 feet. The door itself he cut to fit the rough opening, hung it on the hinges with the pin side protected from the weather, and lined the perimeter with the foam weather stripping compressed tight when the door closed. It was not a door that would win any prizes for craftsmanship, but it sealed. And in 9-degree weather, with the wind starting to push 30 miles per hour outside the barn, a door that seals is worth more than one that looks beautiful. He finished the structure on the evening of the second day, about 2 hours before the main front arrived. And he knew it was coming because the sky had been doing the same thing for the past 6 hours that every experienced outdoor worker learns to read eventually. A particular shade of gray that sits too heavy and too still. A quality in the air that is hard to describe precisely, but that registers as a kind of pressure, a held breath before something large exhales. He had the stove running steadily, burning seasoned oak from the half-cord he had purchased, the wood splitting cleanly and catching fast, and burning with the dense, even heat that good hardwood produces when it has been properly dried and stored. The structure was holding temperature. He checked the thermometer he had hung just inside the door, and it read 48 degrees, with the stove burning at a moderate rate. Not hot, just consistent. He added 2 more logs and closed the damper slightly to slow the burn, and watched the temperature climb over the next 20 minutes to 54, then 57, then settle around 60. Outside, the storm arrived like something that had been building up pressure for weeks and finally found a release. The wind hit the barn in gusts that made the entire structure shift and groan, that sent loose material skittering across the property. That filled the air with a sound, somewhere between a howl and a roar, that is specific to winter storms on open land, and that carries in it a quality of indifference, a reminder that the weather has no opinion about you, and no interest in whether you are ready. Daniel sat inside his Quonset cabin on the folding chair he had set up near the stove, eating a can of beans he had heated directly on the stovetop, and he listened to the storm work on the barn around him. He could hear the wind finding the gaps in the old boards. He could hear the temperature differential between inside and outside, expressing itself as pops and creaks in the lumber. He could feel through the soles of his boots the tiny vibrations that the gusts transmitted through the concrete floor. And he was warm. There is something specific that happens to a person when they have been cold. Genuinely cold, in the way that makes you uncertain whether you will be able to stay warm. And then they find themselves in a place that is holding heat against the weather outside. It is not just physical comfort, though it is that. It is something that reaches into the part of you that handles survival assessment, the old part that monitors threat level without being asked, and tells it that the threat has decreased. Your nervous system notices before your conscious mind does. Your shoulders drop, your jaw unclenches, that you take the first breath that doesn't have a small edge of controlled anxiety in it. Daniel sat in his chair with his beans and his coffee, and the stove ticking steadily beside him, and he felt that shift happen. He was not out of difficulty. He still had no permanent home, still had 2 weeks until his next paycheck, still had the entire aftermath of what had happened to his life to deal with. But right now, tonight, in this specific storm, he was okay. If you have ever felt alone in a way that felt like the ground had shifted under you, like the things you thought were solid had turned out to be something less, I think you might understand what that moment felt like for Daniel. Not triumphant, not resolved, just quietly sufficient. Like something small but real had been accomplished against something large and indifferent. If that kind of story is the kind of thing that matters to you, consider subscribing to stay connected with this community. There are more stories like this one, stories about people who faced real difficulties and built something real in response, and they are worth hearing. The storm lasted roughly 2.5 days. The temperature outside dropped to -21 at its lowest point, which was the 3rd night, and the wind didn't fully let up until the morning of the 4th day. Daniel burned through about 1/4 of his half-cord of wood during that period, which was reasonable for the size of the space and the severity of the conditions, and which left him with enough remaining to get through another week of cold weather without resupply. The Quonset cabin held temperature throughout. The lowest it got inside during the worst of the storm was 42 degrees, which happened on the 3rd night when he let the stove burn down too far while he slept and woke to find it nearly out. He rebuilt the fire in 5 minutes from the coals and got the temperature back up to 55 within the hour. He slept in his sleeping bag on the cot, fully clothed the way you do when the margin is still thin. But he slept. What he had built was not elegant. He knew that. He was a professional framer, and he could see every place where a different choice, or a better material, or more time would have produced a finer result. The plywood joints weren't tight enough in 2 places, and he had packed the gaps with strips of foam. The interior insulation had a cold spot in the northwest corner, where he hadn't gotten the bats to seat properly between the ribs, and he could feel it as a slight chill whenever the wind was hitting from that direction. So the stove was placed well, but the pipe angle meant it could backdraft in certain wind conditions, and he had learned to adjust the damper preemptively when he heard the wind shift to the northwest. These were the kinds of things that only the person who built something can see clearly. To anyone else looking in from the outside, what they would have seen was a functional, heated, structurally sound, small shelter inside a barn that had no business being warm, producing warmth. The gap between what Daniel could see and what anyone else would see was the gap between a craftsman's self-assessment and the view from outside it. Glenn Harwick stopped by on the 5th day after the roads had cleared. He walked into the barn and stood looking at the Quonset structure without saying anything. He walked around it. He knocked on the plywood shell. He opened the door and looked inside at the stove and the cot and the folding table. Glenn was not a man who gave compliments easily. He had built things for 30 years and had a demanding standard for what qualified as good work. He looked at the structure one more time and said it was better than he expected, and that the chimney installation was correct, which from Glenn Harwick was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. Then he asked if Daniel had eaten a real meal in the past 3 days, and when Daniel said mostly canned goods and coffee, Glenn told him to lock up the barn and get in the truck because his wife had made more soup than 2 people could eat. Roy Kessler came by the 2nd week and found Daniel still living there. He asked a series of questions with the focused attention of a farmer who evaluates things by whether they work rather than whether they conform to expectations. He had no objection to Daniel staying through the winter. He said he felt better about the barn being watched over. He also said he wouldn't have believed it was possible to make that barn livable in 2 days with the materials Daniel had described, and that he was glad to have been wrong. There were other people who heard about it and came to see. One was a young couple who wanted to understand their options if the worst happened to their own housing. They sat with Daniel in the Quonset cabin, and he explained the construction with the same directness he had brought to building it, I'm pointing out what worked and what he would do differently, explaining the thermal logic of the curve and the importance of stove placement. He was not performing expertise. He was just describing what he had done. The couple built a smaller version on a piece of rural land a family member let them use, and they lived in it for 4 months before their housing situation resolved. They learned what Daniel had learned, that a structure does not have to be perfect to be effective, that the distance between a plan and a working solution is mostly made of the willingness to keep going when real material meets real conditions and the two don't perfectly align. Daniel stayed in the Quonset cabin through February and into March, roughly 12 weeks total. During that time, he made several improvements. He added insulation in the cold corner and solved the chill problem. He built a small vestibule at the door, just a 3-foot enclosed entry space that created an airlock, and this single addition reduced his wood consumption noticeably by eliminating the burst of cold air that entered every time the door opened. He hung shelving on the interior walls and built a small work counter from salvaged material, transforming the space from something purely functional into something that felt, incrementally, like a place where a person actually lived. The experience changed how Daniel thought about buildings in a way that carried into his professional work. So he had always understood framing as a technical discipline, the geometry of structure, the behavior of materials under load. What the Quonset cabin added was something harder to articulate, but important. When you build a house for a client, the accountability is real but mediated. You have inspectors and codes and a professional relationship sitting between you and the direct consequence of every decision. When you build the thing you are going to sleep in on a negative 20-degree night, the feedback loop is immediate and personal. He became a better framer because of it. Glenn Harwick noticed within the first month, and he said so the way experienced builders say things, not with a compliment exactly, but with the assignment of slightly more complex work with slightly less oversight. In the spring, when Daniel had found a proper apartment and was preparing to dismantle the Quonset cabin so Roy Kessler could use the space again, he stood inside it for a few minutes before starting. The stove was cold. Morning light came through the gaps in the plywood, in thin lines across the concrete floor. He had been warm here on nights when the thermometer outside read numbers that are hard to imagine if you have spent your whole life in heated spaces. He had built it alone in 2 days, with borrowed materials and a plan scratched on a gas receipt, and it had held through everything the winter put against it. He took a photograph before he started taking it apart. Not to post anywhere or show anyone, just because some things are worth having a record of. The image showed the curved interior, the stove in the corner, the cot along one wall, a coffee cup on the folding table. It was a small and temporary thing built out of necessity in the worst days of a difficult year. But it had been real, and it had worked, and it had been his. The deeper truth of stories like Daniel's is not really about construction technique, though the technique is part of what makes it worth telling. The deeper truth is about what a person discovers they are capable of, when the margin between okay and not okay narrows to what they can build with their hands. Most of us move through our lives with enough buffer that we never find out what that margin looks like for us specifically. Daniel found out. And what he found out was that the skills he had spent years building in service of other people's shelter were also, in the right circumstance, sufficient for his own. That is not a small thing to discover about yourself. He didn't talk about the winter in the barn much in the years that followed. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because it was one of those experiences that is hard to describe in a way that communicates what it actually was. From the outside, it sounds like a story about hardship and survival, which it was. From the inside, it felt like something more specific. Something about the relationship between a person and the things they know how to do. about what it means to be genuinely useful. Not useful to a client, or a project, or a paycheck, but useful to your own continued existence on a specific cold night when the temperature is falling and the structure you built is deciding whether it is going to hold. It held. That is the simple end of the technical part of the story. The Quonset cabin held through 12 weeks of a hard winter, through temperatures that went to -21 and back up, through wind events that shook the barn around it, through the daily wear of actually living in it rather than just theoretically surviving in it. The arches held their curve, the insulation performed, the stove heated the space correctly, the door sealed against the weather. The chimney drew clean. Every decision Daniel had made in those 2 days of construction, every calculation he had worked through on the back of a gas receipt at midnight in a truck cab at 15 degrees, had been sufficient. Not perfect. Sufficient. And sufficient when the storm is outside and you are inside and the stove is burning is everything. There is something about a person who faces a hard situation and responds not with panic or defeat, but with clarity and work that I find genuinely worth documenting. Not because it makes for a tidy lesson, or because there is a simple moral to extract and apply universally, but because these stories are true, and because they remind us that the distance between a bad situation and a workable one is often exactly the width of the skills you have accumulated and the willingness to apply them without waiting for conditions to improve. Daniel did not wait for conditions to improve. He looked at what he had, which was tools and lumber and understanding and time, and he built a warm place to be in a cold world. That is an old human act, the oldest there is, and it is worth remembering. If you stayed with this story all the way to here, I want to say something to you directly. Thank you. Not in the way that people say thank you at the end of things as a formality, but genuinely. You gave your time to this story, which means something, because time is the thing none of us can make more of. I hope something in Daniel's story reached something in your own experience, whether that is a time when you had to figure something out with not quite enough of what you needed, or a moment when you surprised yourself with what you were capable of, or just the quiet recognition that building something real and necessary with your hands is one of the most fundamentally human things a person can do. If you are in a hard place right now, I hope this reminded you that sufficiency is possible even when it doesn't look like it yet. And if you are not, I hope it reminded you what a person looks like when they decide to solve the problem in front of them rather than wait for a better one. There is another story waiting for you on this channel about someone else who faced real difficulty and built something real in answer to it. If this one mattered to you, that one will too.